I'm Tucker Saldana, 67, and I thought I'd raise decent kids who understood sacrifice. After 3 months recovering from emergency heart surgery at the VA hospital, fighting for my life while reliving memories of Vietnam, that the medications dragged up from decades past, came home to find a sold sign planted in my front yard. My own children had somehow removed my name from the deed and were splitting the proceeds of my childhood home. The betrayal cut deeper than any enemy fire I'd faced overseas. But what I discovered in my father's old military trunk would remind me that a Marine never truly stops fighting. Some battles are worth everything, and this one was about to teach my ungrateful children exactly what their old man was made of. The discharge papers crinkled in my trembling hands as I stood on the sidewalk, staring at what used to be my home. 3 months, that's how long I'd been fighting for my life in that sterile VA hospital room, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed like some mechanical heartbeat, keeping me tethered to this world. The medications had been the worst part, not the surgery, not even the pain. Those damn pills dragged memories up from places I'd buried them 40 years ago. Vietnam came rushing back in vivid, unwanted detail. The humidity that clung to your skin like death. The sound of helicopters cutting through jungle air. The faces of boys who never made it home. I'd wake up in that hospital bed thinking I was back in the bush, calling out orders to soldiers who existed only in my fractured dreams. The nurses were kind. They understood, they said. Many of the old-timers went through this after major surgery. The anesthesia, the trauma, the ice, all conspired to unlock doors in your mind that you'd nailed shut decades ago. But understanding didn't make it easier when I'd find myself crying over breakfast. Mourning friends whose names I'd trained myself to forget. Now I stood here, finally free of those chemical phantoms, only to face a betrayal that cut deeper than any jungle blade. Mrs. Patterson from next door was watering her roses, stealing glances at me over her garden fence. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away, her face flushed with embarrassment. She knew. They all knew. The whole neighborhood had watched my children come and go while I lay unconscious. Watched them load my belongings into trucks. Watched strangers walk through my house with measuring tapes and clipboards. How long had they been planning this? The question gnawed at me as I approached my front door and found it locked with a different deadbolt. The spare key under the ceramic frog my late wife Helen had placed there 20 years ago was gone, along with the frog itself. I walked around to the back, my legs still unsteady from months of bed rest. The garden I'd tended for 30 years was overgrown. The tomato plants I'd started before my surgery now withered brown stalks. Even the bird feeder hung empty, and I realized with a sharp pang that no one had cared for the cardinals and finches that Helen used to love watching from the kitchen window. The back door was locked too, but the window above the sink had always stuck, never closing quite right. My children knew this. I'd asked Marcus to fix it a dozen times over the years. Now I was grateful for his procrastination. I pushed it open and hauled myself through, landing heavily on the kitchen counter. The house felt hollow, stripped of its soul. They'd left the furniture probably because it wasn't worth selling, but everything personal was gone. Photo albums, Helen's china cabinet, the bronze star I'd earned and never displayed. Even my coffee mug, the one with "World's Greatest Dad" that Diana had given me 15 years ago, was missing from its usual spot by the sink. I found the discharge papers scattered on the floor where they'd fallen, and as I bent to retrieve them, I noticed something else. Fresh gouges in the hardwood, where they'd dragged heavy items out. They hadn't even been careful about it. Why would they be? In their minds, it wasn't my house anymore. The dining room table still bore the rectangular outline where Helen's jewelry box had sat for 20 years, gathering dust in the same spot since the day she died. Now, even that small shrine to her memory was gone. Sold off like everything else that mattered. I moved through the house like a detective at a crime scene, which, I was beginning to realize, is exactly what this was. In Marcus's old bedroom, I found a manila folder stuffed behind the radiator, forgotten in their haste or deliberately hidden. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing a stack of documents that made my blood run cold. Power of attorney, forms, signed with what looked like my signature. Quitclaim deeds, transferring ownership of the property. Medical statements declaring me incompetent due to age-related cognitive decline and medication-induced confusion. Even a doctor's note from some physician I'd never heard of, stating that I was unable to manage my own affairs. The signature on the power of attorney looked convincing to convincing. Marcus had always been gifted at forgery, a skill I'd discovered during his teenage years when report cards would mysteriously improve between school and home. Back then, I'd thought it was harmless mischief. Now I understood it had been practice, but it was the medical evaluation that hurt the most. Dr. Amanda Foster, geriatric psychiatrist, had apparently examined me and found me suffering from moderate dementia with episodes of paranoid ideation. The evaluation was dated 3 weeks into my hospital stay. When I was still unconscious from the surgery, I sat heavily in my old recliner. One of the few things they'd left and studied the documents more carefully. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. My children had systematically stripped me of my rights while I fought for my life. They'd used my military medical records, twisted my post-surgical confusion, and fabricated evidence of mental incompetence. The phone rang, startling me from my investigation. For a moment, I thought it might be one of them, calling to explain, to apologize, to tell me this was all some terrible mistake. Instead, it was a cheerful realtor named Brad. "Mr. Saldana, I'm so glad I caught you. I wanted to follow up on the closing tomorrow. The buyers are very excited about the property, and we just need to coordinate the final walkthrough." "There's not going to be a closing," I interrupted. A pause. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not sure I understand. The contracts are signed. The financing is approved. This is Tucker Saldana. This is my house. My children had no right to sell it." Another, longer pause. "Mr. Saldana, I think there might be some confusion here. According to our records, you signed over power of attorney to your son Marcus 3 months ago, due to health issues. All the paperwork has been properly filed with the county." "I never signed any power of attorney, sir. I have the documents right here, notarized and witnessed. Perhaps you should speak with your family about this." I hung up without another word. Brad the realtor didn't know he was part of a crime. To him, this was just another routine house sale, properly documented and legally sound. The system had been designed to protect people like me, but my children had turned that protection into a weapon. In the kitchen, I found more evidence of their presence. Empty beer bottles in the recycling bin, takeout containers in the garbage, fresh scratches on the walls where they'd moved furniture. They'd treated my home like their personal storage unit, dividing up my life while I lay helpless in a hospital bed. The cruelest discovery was in Helen's sewing room. They'd left behind a single photo. Face down on the floor, our wedding picture from 1978. Helen in her simple white dress. Me in my dress blues. Both of us young and convinced we had forever. The glass was cracked, and I wondered if it had been dropped accidentally or thrown in anger. I held that cracked wedding photo against my chest and let the memories wash over me. Not the drugged-up nightmares from the hospital, but the real ones, the ones that mattered. Helen's laugh echoing through these same rooms. The sound of small feet running up and down the hallways. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings when this house was alive with love and hope. Helen died when the kids were young. Marcus was 16, Diana 14, Kevin barely 12. Cancer took her slowly, giving us time to say goodbye, but never enough time to prepare for the emptiness that followed. I remember sitting in this very chair after her funeral. 3 scared children looking to me for answers I didn't have. Life insurance money lasted exactly 8 months. After that, it was all on me, a Marine veteran, working construction and trying to raise 3 kids alone. I took every overtime shift I could get, sometimes working 16-hour days just to keep food on the table. The motorcycle I'd bought myself as a 40th birthday present. Sold it to pay for Marcus's SAT prep classes. The fishing boat I dreamed of owning someday. That dream became Diana's prom dress and Kevin's baseball equipment. I mortgaged this house twice to pay for their educations. Marcus wanted law school, Harvard, no less. Diana needed money for her teaching degree. Kevin changed majors 4 times, each switch costing more than the last. I never complained, never made them feel guilty about the sacrifices. That's what fathers do. That's what Helen would have wanted. The photo from 1985 sat on the mantel for years, me, with all 3 kids, after Diana's high school graduation. Marcus had his arm around my shoulder, already talking about his bright future-in-law. Diana was beaming, having just been accepted to State University. Kevin was only 15 then, still believing his old man hung the moon. "You don't have to worry about anything, Dad," Marcus had said that night. "We're going to take care of you someday. You've done so much for us." Double quotes. Diana had nodded enthusiastically. "When I'm a teacher and have my own place, you can come live with me. We'll have Sunday dinners every week, just like Mom used to make." Even Kevin, young as he was, had chimed in. "I'm going to be rich and buy you a big house, Dad, with a pool and everything." Those promises felt so real then, spoken with the earnest conviction that only comes from young hearts that haven't yet learned how easy it is to forget gratitude when it becomes inconvenient. I worked until my body gave out 62 years old and my knees couldn't take the construction sites anymore. The disability check from the VA barely covered the utilities, but I told myself it would be okay. My children were established now. They understood sacrifice because they'd watched me make it every day of their lives. But prosperity changed them in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus got his law degree and moved to the city, visiting less and less as his practice grew. Diana married a man who didn't much care for her father. And suddenly Sunday dinners became monthly phone calls that felt more like obligations than connections. Kevin bounced from job to job, always with his hand out, always promising this next venture would be different. The house became my anchor and my burden, too big for one old man, too full of memories to leave. I'd sit in this chair on quiet evenings, listening to the settling sounds of a home that had sheltered for decades of life, wondering when my children had stopped seeing it as the place where they'd been loved unconditionally and started seeing it as their inheritance. Now I understood they'd been calculating its value for years, waiting for me to die or become incapacitated enough to take it. They'd grown tired of waiting for nature to take its course, so they'd decided to speed things along with forged documents and fabricated medical reports. The wedding photo stared up at me from its cracked glass. Helen's smile, unchanged by time or betrayal. She'd always been the optimist, the one who saw the best in everyone, even when they disappointed her. What would she think of her children now? Would she find excuses for them, as she had when they were young and testing boundaries? Or would she finally see what I was beginning to understand, that some people take your love for granted until it becomes a weakness they can exploit? I found the real estate listing on my laptop, one of the few electronics they'd left behind, probably because it was too old to be worth anything. The Zillow page showed professional photos of my house, staged with furniture I didn't recognize. Charming 3-bedroom ranch in established neighborhood. Move-in ready. $340,000. $340,000. Split 3 ways. That was over $100,000 each, enough to solve a lot of problems. Enough to justify betraying the man who'd raised them. Marcus had always been the golden child. The one who was supposed to make it big. Harvard Law Review. Prestigious firm downtown. The whole package Helen and I had dreamed of when we scraped together his tuition money. But success in law wasn't guaranteed. And from what I'd pieced together from neighborhood gossip and his wife's social media posts, Marcus's practice wasn't thriving the way he'd hoped. Criminal defense work was feast or famine. And Marcus had developed expensive tastes to match his Harvard pedigree. The big house in the suburbs, the German car, private schools for his kids, all of it financed by credit, and the assumption that big cases would keep coming. But big cases were rare, and the gambling addiction he thought he'd hidden from the family was apparently bleeding him dry. Diana's situation was different, but equally desperate. My daughter had always been tender-hearted, the one who brought home stray cats and cried over roadkill. She'd become a special education teacher because she wanted to help children who reminded her of herself. Quiet, overlooked, underestimated. It was noble work that paid almost nothing. Her divorce 3 years ago had left her financially devastated. Her ex-husband, a charming sociopath who'd hidden his debts until after the wedding, had stuck her with most of their joint obligations when he disappeared to start fresh in another state. Now she was raising Emma, her 7-year-old daughter with autism, on a teacher's salary, while juggling therapy appointments and special programs that insurance barely covered. I'd helped when I could, slipping her money for Emma's occupational therapy or covering the grocery bill when things got tight. But my own resources were limited, and Diana was too proud to ask for more than I could spare. Kevin was the youngest and, unfortunately, the most like his mother's brother, dreamer, with grand schemes and no follow-through. At 35, he'd burned through more business ventures than most people attempt in a lifetime. The food truck that failed because he couldn't handle the permits. The app development company that folded when he discovered coding was harder than he'd thought. The cryptocurrency investment firm that lost his clients money and nearly landed him in jail. Each failure had been accompanied by elaborate explanations and passionate requests for one more chance. I'd stopped lending him money years ago, but that hadn't stopped him from trying to monetize our relationship in other ways, selling family heirlooms when he thought I wouldn't notice, using my name to open credit accounts that I'd only discover when collection agencies called. The 3 of them had met here in this house 6 months ago, I remembered now. I'd been dealing with some chest pains that turned out to be nothing serious, but I'd mentioned them during our monthly check-in calls. Within a week, all three had descended for what they called a family meeting to discuss my long-term care needs. I'd been touched at the time, grateful that my children were thinking ahead and wanting to help. We'd sat around this same dining room table while they asked careful questions about my finances, my medical history, my plans for the future. Marcus had taken notes in his legal pad. Diana had made sympathetic noises about the burden of aging alone. And Kevin had suggested I might be more comfortable in an assisted living facility where professionals could monitor my health. Now, I realized it hadn't been concern, it had been reconnaissance. They'd been evaluating my assets, testing my mental acuity, laying the groundwork for what they'd done while I lay unconscious in that hospital bed. The most chilling part was how systematic it had been. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation, it was calculated fraud, planned months in advance, and executed with the precision of a military operation. They'd researched the laws, found a corrupt doctor willing to falsify records, and coordinated their stories so perfectly that everyone from the bank to the realtor believed they were acting in my best interests. My own children had become strangers, capable of a cruelty I'd never imagined possible. But as I sat in that empty house, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced since Vietnam, the cold, focused rage of a Marine who'd been pushed too far. The legal aid office downtown looked exactly like what it was, a place where people with no money went when they had nowhere else to turn. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on worn furniture and outdated motivational posters. I sat in the waiting room, clutching my folder of evidence, feeling every one of my 67 years. Mr. Saldana, a young Asian woman, appeared at the reception desk, her business card reading Sarah Chen, attorney at law, in simple black letters. She was probably 30, maybe younger, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an air of competence that seemed too mature for her age. Her office was small but organized. Law books stacked neatly on shelves that reached to the ceiling. She gestured for me to sit across from her desk and pulled out a yellow legal pad, the same kind Marcus used. I noticed with a bitter pang. "Tell me what happened," she said simply. I spread the documents across her desk like evidence at a court. She examined each page carefully, her expression growing darker as she absorbed the scope of the fraud. When she reached the forged power of attorney, she pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the signature for several minutes. "This is sophisticated," she said finally. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. The medical evaluation, the witness signatures, even the notary stamp, it all looks legitimate on the surface. But it's not. No, it's not. The question is proving that in court." She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the same intensity she'd applied to the documents. "Can you prove you didn't sign these papers?" "I was unconscious for the first month of my hospital stay. The signature is dated during that time. We'll need medical records confirming that." "What about the doctor who supposedly evaluated you?" "Never heard of her before today." Sarah made notes on her pad. "Dr. Amanda Foster. I'll look her up, but my guess is she's either fictional or someone your children paid to falsify records. Either way, it's criminal fraud." The word hung in the air between you. My children weren't just ungrateful or selfish. They were criminals who'd committed felonies against their own father. "What are my options?" I asked. "Legally, you have several paths. We can file a police report for elder abuse and fraud. We can seek an emergency injunction to stop the house sale. We can challenge the power of attorney in probate court." She paused, studying my face. "But I need to be honest with you, Mr. Saldana. This is going to be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally brutal. Your children hired good lawyers, and they're going to fight back hard." "I'm a Marine," I said quietly. "I know about fighting." Something shifted in her expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "My grandfather was Navy in World War II. He used to say the hardest battles weren't always against foreign enemies. Your grandfather was a wise man." She flipped to a fresh page on her legal pad. "Tell me about your military service. Any combat experience?" "2 tours in Vietnam. Bronze Star, Purple Heart." The medals were probably in some pawn shop by now, sold along with everything else my children had deemed valuable. "Good. That establishes your mental competence and character. Veterans don't develop sudden dementia without obvious medical cause." She made more notes. "What about your finances? Can you afford to fight this?" It was a fair question that cut to the heart of my problem. "Not much. VA disability and Social Security, maybe $3,000 in savings. I work on contingency for cases like this. If we win, I take a percentage of what we recover. If we lose, you don't pay attorney fees, but there will still be court costs, filing fees, expert witnesses, probably $5,000 to $10,000 before it's over. $5,000 might as well have been $50,000 on my budget. But then I remembered something: my father's old trunk in the basement, the one I'd been avoiding since Helen died. Maybe it was time to see what the old man had left behind. Sarah handed me her business card, the same one I'd been clutching in the waiting room. Think about it overnight. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Your children are betting that you'll be too old, too tired, or too broke to fight them. Proving them wrong is going to take everything you've got. As I stood to leave, she added, "There's something else you should know. Cases like this, they sometimes attract media attention. Elder abuse stories involving veterans, the newspapers love them. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" I thought about my quiet life, my privacy, my desire to keep family business within the family. Then I thought about my children sleeping soundly in beds purchased with my betrayal, and I felt that cold marine rage settle into my bones. "Ma'am," I said, "I've been keeping my family's secrets for long enough." The basement felt like a tomb, musty and filled with the accumulated debris of 40 years of family life. Christmas decorations in labeled boxes, outgrown bicycles, and in the far corner, my father's old steamer trunk, the one piece of his legacy I'd never been able to throw away or open. Dad had been a man of few words, a World War II veteran who came home from the Pacific with secrets he never shared and wounds that went deeper than the shrapnel scars on his legs. He'd worked at the steel mill for 30 years, raised 5 children on a blue-collar salary, and died of a heart attack at 63, probably from the stress of trying to keep everyone else afloat. The trunk's brass corners were green with tarnish, but the lock still turned with the key I found taped to the underside. The hinges protested as I lifted the heavy lid, releasing the smell of mothballs and old leather that immediately transported me back to childhood. On top lay his dress uniform from the war. Navy blue wool, still sharp, despite decades of storage. Beneath that, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, I found his medals: the Purple Heart from Iwo Jima, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, campaign ribbons I'd never known he'd earned. My father had been a hero, and I'd never known the extent of it. But it was the manila envelope marked for Tucker open, "When you need strength," that stopped my heart. The handwriting was unmistakably his, that careful script he'd learned in a one-room schoolhouse before the war changed everything. Inside were letters, dozens of them, dating back to 1947. Letters from his brothers asking for money he didn't have. Letters from his sister demanding he sell the family farm to pay for her husband's debts. Letters from his own father, criticizing his choices and questioning his competence as a man and provider. My grandfather, apparently, had been a bitter drunk who'd tried to manipulate his war hero son into supporting his gambling habits. When Dad refused, the old man had turned the rest of the family against him, painting him as selfish and ungrateful for the sacrifices they'd made while he was playing soldier in the Pacific. The parallels to my own situation were so precise, they made my hands shake. At the bottom of the envelope was a letter in Dad's own handwriting, dated just 6 months before his death. "Son, if you're reading this, it means you found yourself in a situation I hope you never have to face. But if history has taught me anything, it's that ungrateful family members are like weeds. They keep growing back, no matter how much you try to nurture them into something better." I spent 30 years trying to prove my worth to people who saw my love as weakness and my generosity as obligation. I gave away pieces of myself until there was nothing left, and it was never enough. They always wanted more. And when I finally said no, they painted me as the villain in their stories. Don't make my mistakes, Tucker. Sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones most willing to destroy you for their own gain. When that happens, you have 2 choices. Let them break you, or stand up and fight for what's rightfully yours. I was too tired to fight by the time I understood what was happening. But you're stronger than I ever was. You've got more spine and more courage, and you've earned the right to defend yourself without guilt or apology. In the bottom of this trunk, you'll find something I've been saving for an emergency. It's not much, but it might be enough to help you stand your ground when standing is all you have left. Remember, being a good father doesn't mean being a doormat. Love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just weakness, wearing a mask. Your proud father, Frank Saldana. I set the letter aside with trembling hands and dug deeper into the trunk. At the very bottom, wrapped in an old army blanket, I found a metal box that rattled when I moved it. Inside was savings bonds, hundreds of them, dating back to the 1950s and 1960s. Each one was made out to me, purchased a little at a time, with money my father had somehow managed to save from his mill worker's salary. There had to be $50,000 worth, maybe more after decades of interest. My father, the man I'd thought had died with nothing to leave his children, had been building me a war chest for 40 years. He'd known, somehow, that I might need the ammunition to fight a battle he'd been too broken to win himself. I sat on that basement floor, surrounded by the evidence of my father's love and foresight, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about my house anymore, or even about my children's betrayal. This was about breaking a cycle of family dysfunction that had apparently been going on for generations. My father had let his family walk all over him because he was too good-hearted to fight back. I'd made the same mistake with my children, confusing love with submission and sacrifice with surrender. But Dad had given me something he'd never had: the resources to fight back and the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary. The purple heart felt warm in my palm as I held it up to the basement light. My father had earned this medal by standing his ground against an enemy that wanted to destroy him. Now it was my turn to stand my ground against enemies who shared my blood but had forgotten my love. For the first time since I'd seen that sold sign in my yard, I felt hope stirring in my chest. My children had counted on my weakness, just as my father's family had counted on his. They were about to learn that some Marines don't know how to surrender, especially when they're fighting for their home. Sarah Chen looked impressed when I walked into her office the next morning with a cashier's check for $20,000, enough to cover all the legal costs and then some. The savings bonds had been worth more than I'd hoped, and converting them had felt like unleashing my father's delayed revenge against ungrateful family members. "This changes everything," she said, studying the check. "With this kind of resources, we can hire investigators, expert witnesses, whatever we need to prove your case." But I had a different idea. "Before we bring in outsiders, let me do some reconnaissance of my own. Marines are taught to gather intelligence before engaging the enemy." She raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" "My children think I'm a confused old man who doesn't understand modern technology. They're about to learn how wrong they are." The first step was digital archaeology. Despite what my kids believed, I'd been using computers longer than they had. The VA had been training veterans in technology skills since the 1990s, and I'd always been a quick learner. It didn't take long to find Marcus's law firm website, complete with client testimonials and case results that painted a picture very different from the success story he'd been telling the family. Most telling was a legal blog post he'd written 6 months ago about protecting elderly clients from financial exploitation. The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with a knife. He'd positioned himself as an expert on elder abuse while planning to abuse his own father. Diana's trail was easier to follow. Her social media posts told the story of a woman drowning in debt and desperation. Photos of Emma at expensive therapy sessions she couldn't afford, check-ins at the food bank, a GoFundMe page for Emma's special needs equipment that had raised less than $500. The hardest part was seeing the genuine love in those posts. Diana really was a devoted mother doing her best for a special needs child. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand the desperation that had driven her to it. Kevin's digital footprint was a disaster of failed ventures and mounting debts. Court records showed 3 business bankruptcies, 2 restraining orders from former business partners, and a small mountain of unpaid taxes. His latest scheme involved cryptocurrency mining, and judging from the equipment purchases I found on his credit card statements, he'd borrowed heavily to fund it. But the real breakthrough came when I drove past Marcus's law office at closing time and followed him to a poker game in the back room of a bar downtown. 3 hours of surveillance confirmed what I'd suspected: my son had a gambling problem that was eating him alive. I watched him lose what looked like several $100s, money he probably didn't have, with the desperate intensity of an addict chasing his losses. The next morning, I visited Diana's apartment building and spoke with her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who loved to talk. Within minutes, I learned that Diana had been behind on rent for 3 months and facing eviction. The landlord had been patient because of Emma's condition, but patience had limits. "She's such a good mother," Mrs. Rodriguez confided, "but that little girl needs so much help, and teachers don't make enough money. It's a shame her family can't help more." The guilt hit me like a punch to the gut. I could have helped more. I should have helped more. But being a victim of my children's desperation didn't make their crimes acceptable. It made them more tragic. Kevin was the easiest to track, because he'd never learned subtlety. His business checking account, which I could access because he'd stupidly made me a joint account holder years ago when he needed an adult cosigner, told the story of his latest failure in stark numbers. He'd borrowed $60,000 to buy cryptocurrency mining equipment, convinced he was going to get rich quick. Instead, the market had crashed, leaving him with worthless hardware and crushing debt. The final piece of intelligence came from an unexpected source: Helen's jewelry. I'd assumed my children had sold it, but a few phone calls to local pawn shops revealed they'd been more systematic than that. They'd taken it to an estate jewelry appraiser downtown, a man named Morrison, who remembered the transaction clearly. 3 of them came in together, he told me over the phone. Very organized, very businesslike. Had all the pieces catalogued and photographed. Said they were settling their late mother's estate. What did you appraise everything at? $47,000. Beautiful pieces. Especially that diamond engagement ring. They seemed surprised it was worth so much. $47,000? Helen's engagement ring alone had been worth $20,000. The ring I'd saved for 6 months to buy on a Marine private's salary. The ring that had represented every dream we'd shared about building a life together. They'd already sold it, all of it. While I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed, my children had been liquidating their mother's memory to pay for their individual failures. But I sat in my car outside Morrison's shop, looking at the receipt he'd given me, and felt the last vestiges of parental hope drain away. This wasn't about financial desperation anymore. This was about 3 people who had looked at their father's love and their mother's memory, and seen nothing but dollar signs. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Dad, heard you're back from the hospital. We should talk soon. Hope you're feeling better. The audacity of IT pretending to care, while simultaneously trying to steal my home, crystallized something cold and hard in my chest. They thought they were playing chess with a confused old man. They were about to discover they'd started a war with a Marine who'd finally remembered how to fight. Back in Vietnam, we had a saying: intelligence without action is just interesting conversation. I'd gathered enough evidence to bury my children legally. But Sarah Chen was right about one thing: this was going to be emotionally brutal. Before I unleashed the full weight of the legal system on them, I owed it to Helen's memory to give them one chance to come clean and make things right. I pulled out my old combat journal from 1969, a small green notebook where I'd recorded tactical observations and mission plans. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the lessons written there were as sharp as ever. Know your enemy. Control the terrain. Never fight on their terms. My children expected me to be emotional, confused, and easily manipulated. They'd built their entire strategy around that assumption. So I would be none of those things. I would be what the Marines had trained me to become: methodical and absolutely relentless. The plan I sketched out was simple but comprehensive. I would confront each child individually, in environments where they felt comfortable and confident. I would give them each the opportunity to confess and offer restitution. And I would record every conversation to use as evidence if they chose to continue their deception. Sarah had provided me with a small digital recorder, legally obtained and perfectly admissible in court. Virginia was a one-party consent state, meaning I could record conversations without their knowledge, as long as I was a participant. The irony wasn't lost on me. My children's betrayal had taught me to approach them like enemy combatants. Marcus would be first. As the architect of the scheme, he deserved the chance to lead the way to redemption or damnation. His law office would be the perfect setting: professional, formal, designed to make him feel powerful and in control. That confidence would make him careless. Diana would be more complicated. Her genuine desperation made her both the most sympathetic and potentially the most cooperative. But her apartment wasn't private enough, and bringing Emma into this mess would be cruel to everyone involved. I'd have to find neutral ground. Kevin would be the wild card. His volatile temperament and history of poor decision-making meant he could go either direction: complete breakdown or violent confrontation. I'd need to be prepared for both possibilities. The recorder felt strange in my shirt pocket as I drove toward Marcus's office that afternoon. Technology had changed since my military days, but the principles remained the same. Document everything. Trust nothing, and always have an extraction plan. Marcus's law firm occupied the 3rd floor of a glass building downtown, all chrome and marble, designed to impress clients with money to spend. The receptionist, a young woman with a professional smile and expensive haircut, looked up as I entered. "I'm here to see Marcus Saldana," I said. "Do you have an appointment?" I'm his father. Something flickered in her expression, recognition, maybe, or embarrassment. She'd probably been here when Marcus was planning my destruction, fielding calls about power of attorney documents and property transfers. Let me see if he's available, she said, reaching for her phone. Through the glass walls of his office, I could see Marcus at his desk, head buried in paperwork. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went deeper than simple fatigue. The weight of his choices was already showing in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. The receptionist hung up and gestured toward his office. He'll see you now. Marcus stood as I entered, his professional smile not quite hiding the wariness in his eyes. Dad, what a surprise. I was just about to call you about my house. I interrupted, settling into the client chair across from his desk. The one you sold while I was unconscious. His smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. I think there might be some confusion here. We were acting under the power of attorney you signed, remember? When you were worried about your health and wanted to make sure someone could handle your affairs. If I never signed any power of attorney. Marcus, Dad, I understand the medications might have affected your memory, but stop. The command came out with enough force to make him flinch. I was a Marine for 8 years before you were born. I've seen enough combat to know the difference between confusion and deception. What I want to know is whether my son is smart enough to see the difference between a mistake and a crime. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled in front of him. Gesture I recognized from his childhood, when he was trying to think his way out of trouble. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You forged my signature on legal documents. You fabricated medical evidence. You conspired with your siblings to defraud an elderly veteran of his primary asset. In legal terms, what would you call that? For the first time since I'd entered his office, Marcus looked genuinely rattled. Those are serious accusations. They're not accusations. They're charges that will be filed with the district attorney's office unless you and your siblings find a way to make this right. He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city skyline as if it might provide answers. When he turned back, his professional mask had slipped entirely, revealing the scared child I remembered from thunderstorm nights, when he'd crawl into bed between Helen and me. Dad, you don't understand the pressure we've been under. I understand pressure, son. I understand it better than you think. Marcus stood with his back to me, shoulders rigid with tension, staring out at a city that had promised him everything and delivered less than he'd hoped. On his credenza sat his law school graduation photo, the same one that had graced our mantle for 15 years, showing a young man in cap and gown with his arm around his proud father. You want to know about pressure? He said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm about to lose everything. The house, the practice, my family's respect, all of it. So you decided to take mine instead. He turned around, and I saw tears in his eyes. The first genuine emotion he'd shown since I'd walked into his office. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. You were supposed to be in the hospital for a few weeks, maybe a month. We were going to fix everything and put it back before you even knew. Put what back? My house, my life savings, my mother's jewelry that you sold for $47,000. His face went white. How did you? I may be old, Marcus, but I'm not stupid. Marines are trained to gather intelligence before engaging the enemy. Right now, I'm trying to decide whether my oldest son is an enemy or just a criminal who can. He'd still be saved. He collapsed into his chair like a man who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. The gambling started small. Poker games with other lawyers. Nothing serious. But when the big cases stopped coming and the bills kept mounting, I thought I could win my way out of the hole. How deep is the hole? 200,000. Maybe more. He laughed bitterly. You know what's funny? I'm an expert in criminal law. I know exactly what we did to you, and I know exactly what the penalties are. Felony elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery. We're looking at 5 to 10 years each if you press charges. The recorder in my pocket was capturing every word, building the case that would destroy my son's career and freedom. But looking at him now, broken, desperate, ashamed, I felt the first crack in my resolve. Why didn't you just ask for help? With what? You're living on disability and Social Security. What could you have done? I could have mortgaged the house, again, sold it myself and split the proceeds. Something legal, something honest, and lived where? Moved in with one of us. He shook his head. Diana's got no room and no money. Kevin's a disaster. And my wife. He'd stopped, as if he'd already said too much. Your wife what? She doesn't know about the gambling. about any of this. If this comes out, if I'm disbarred, she'll take the kids and leave. I'll lose everything that matters. There it was, the real pressure that had driven my golden child to betray his father. Not just financial desperation, but the terror of disappointing a family that expected him to be successful, stable, perfect. You should have thought about that before you decided to forge my signature. I know. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that reminded me of the little boy who used to cry when he broke his toys. God, I know. But when Kevin came to me with this plan, when Diana was facing eviction, when everything was falling apart, seemed like the only way to save everyone, Kevin's plan. Marcus nodded. He's the one who found the dirty doctor, who figured out how to make the paperwork look legitimate. I just provided the legal expertise to make it stick. So Kevin had been the mastermind, not Marcus. My youngest son, the one I'd always seen as the family screw-up, had orchestrated the most sophisticated fraud any of them had ever attempted. What about Diana? How did you convince her to go along with this? She was going to lose Emma. His voice cracked. The state was starting to ask questions about her ability to provide adequate care. If she'd been evicted, if she couldn't afford Emma's therapy, they might have taken her daughter away. That's not just money, Dad, that's her whole world. Each revelation made the betrayal more complex, more tragic. My children hadn't just been greedy, they'd been drowning, and they'd pulled me under to save themselves. So you decided I was expendable. We thought. He stopped, took a breath, started again. We thought you were dying. The heart surgery, the complications, the way you looked so frail in that hospital bed. Kevin said it was like inheriting early, that we'd use the money to solve our problems, and then when you recovered, we'd figure out how to take care of you, with what money you were planning to spend it all. Kevin had this investment opportunity, something with cryptocurrency that was supposed to triple our money in 6 months. We were going to buy you a nice place, somewhere with full-time care, and still have enough left over to fix our problems. The fantasy was so elaborate, so divorced from reality, that I almost felt sorry for him. And when that investment failed, when Kevin's get-rich-quick scheme collapsed, like all the others, Marcus stared at his hands. I don't know. I wasn't thinking that far ahead. I was just trying to keep my head above water for one more day. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a copy of the forged power of attorney, placing it on his desk. Between us, this is your handwriting, Marcus, your notary, your criminal conspiracy. Whatever pressure you were under, whatever desperation drove you to this, you're still responsible for your choices. He looked at the document like it was a death sentence. What do you want from me? I want my house back. I want my belongings returned. I want restitution for what you stole. And I want the truth, all of it, in writing, signed and witnessed. And if I do that, then maybe we can find a way through this that doesn't end with my son in prison. For the first time since our conversation began, hope flickered in his eyes. You'd do that. After everything we did, you're still my son, Marcus. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it means I'm willing to fight for you instead of against you if you're willing to fight for what's right. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. What do you need me to do? Diana's apartment was in a complex that had seen better decades. The kind of place where working families lived when they couldn't afford anything better, but were too proud for subsidized housing. The parking lot was cracked concrete, patched with tar, and the playground equipment looked like it had been installed sometime during the Clinton administration. I knocked on apartment to be at 6 o'clock. After Emma would be home from school, but before bedtime routines began. Diana answered, wearing scrubs. She'd been working double shifts at the hospital to supplement her teaching income, I realized. She looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical fatigue. Dad. Her surprise seemed genuine, followed quickly by guilt that flickered across her face before she could hide it. I didn't know you were. When did you get out of the hospital? 3 days ago. I studied her face, looking for the daughter I'd raised, the one who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. Can we talk? She glanced back into the apartment, where I could hear the sound of a television and Emma's voice repeating phrases. Something she did when she was processing new information, or feeling anxious, of course. Come in. She stepped aside, but her body language remained tense, guarded. The apartment was small but clean, decorated with Emma's artwork and photos of the two of them together. A hospital bill sat open on the kitchen counter, $3,200 for Emma's latest round of therapy. Another envelope marked final notice peeked out from beneath it. Emma appeared from the living room. A beautiful 7-year-old, with Diana's dark hair and Helen's intelligent eyes. She looked at me with the careful assessment that children with autism often showed strangers, trying to categorize me in her mental filing system. "Emma, this is Grandpa Tucker," Diana said gently. "Remember, I showed you his picture?" Emma nodded, but didn't approach instead. She held up a drawing she'd been working at a house with stick figures in front of it. "This is my family," she announced. "Mummy and me and Grandpa Tucker." The innocence of it hit me like a physical blow. In Emma's world, I was still part of their family, still someone who belonged in their house drawing. She had no idea that her mother had helped steal my house to pay for her care. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I managed. "Emma, why don't you finish your homework in your room? Grandpa and I need to talk about grown-up things." Emma gathered her papers and crayons with the methodical precision that was characteristic of her condition. As she passed me, she stopped and looked up with those serious eyes. "Are you sick? Mummy said you were sick, and that's why we couldn't visit." "I was sick, but I'm better now." She nodded, as if this made perfect sense, and disappeared into her bedroom, leaving Diana and me alone with the weight of what we both knew was coming. Diana collapsed onto a second-hand couch, covering her face with her hands. "I know why you're here. Do you?" Marcus called. "He said you found out about the house." She looked up at me, tears already forming. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." Unlike Marcus's calculated performance, Diana's remorse felt genuine, but genuine remorse didn't undo the crime or erase the betrayal. "Tell me why," I said simply. The whole story came pouring out: the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover, the special programs Emma needed but couldn't afford, the constant fear that her daughter would fall behind or, worse, be taken away if Diana couldn't provide adequate care. "The occupational therapy alone is $800 a month," she said, wiping her nose with a tissue. "Speech therapy is another $600. Then there's the special tutoring, the sensory equipment, the dietary supplements the doctor recommended." I was spending more on Emma's care than I was making teaching. She pulled out a folder thick with medical bills and insurance denials. "Look at this $23,000 in the last 6 months alone. I applied for assistance programs, tried to get grants, even started a GoFundMe page that raised less than $500. I was working 60-hour weeks between teaching and the hospital job, and it still wasn't enough. So, you decided to steal from me." Kevin said it would just be temporary. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He had this investment plan that was supposed to triple the money in a few months. We were going to pay everything back, and still have enough to secure Emma's future. Kevin's plans don't work, Diana. They never have. I know that now. But when you're drowning, when you're watching your child struggle and you can't help her, you'll grab onto anything that looks like a lifeline." I thought about Emma's drawing, about the innocence of a child who just wanted her family to be together. "What did you think would happen to me?" "We thought," she stopped, swallowed hard. "We thought you might not make it through the surgery, and if you did, we thought we'd have time to figure something out. Maybe find you a nice assisted living place where you'd be taken care of. With money you'd stolen from me. With money we'd invested and multiplied." Kevin showed us projections, charts, testimonials from other people who'd made fortunes with his system. It seemed real. The delusion was heartbreaking in its naivety. My children had convinced themselves they were saving me while they destroyed me and Diana Sweet, trusting Diana had believed it because she desperately needed it to be true. "The jewelry," I said. "Your mother's engagement ring. How could you sell that?" Diana broke down completely then, sobbing with the abandon of someone who'd been carrying unbearable guilt for months. "That was the worst part. I knew what that ring meant to you, to Mom. But Emma needed surgery for her hearing implant. And insurance called it experimental, $47,000, and they wanted payment up front. You could have asked me for help. With what? You're living on $1,200 a month in disability payments. What could you have done?" It was the same thing Marcus had said, the same rationalization they'd all used to justify treating me like a burden instead of a resource. They'd seen my limited income and assumed I had nothing to offer, never thinking to ask about assets, or options, or alternatives. I had savings bonds, Diana, $50,000 worth that my father left me. I would have given them to you gladly if you'd asked. Her crying stopped abruptly. "What? Your grandfather saved money for 40 years, knowing that someday his family might need help. I found them after you'd already sold everything that mattered to me." The realization of what she'd thrown away, just my trust, but the very help she'd needed, hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over, arms wrapped around her stomach, rocking back and forth. Oh God, what have we done? From her bedroom, Emma called out in distress. Mummy, are you okay? Diana wiped her face and called back. I'm fine, baby, just talking with Grandpa. But she wasn't fine, and we both knew it. She'd destroyed her relationship with her father to save her daughter, only to discover that salvation had been available all along if she'd just had the courage to ask for it honestly. Kevin lived in a townhouse that was too expensive for his income, financed by credit cards and false optimism. The driveway was cluttered with cryptocurrency mining equipment, industrial-grade computers that hummed day and night, consuming electricity he couldn't afford while generating digital coins that were worth less each day. He answered the door in a bathrobe at 2 in the afternoon, his hair unwashed and his eyes bloodshot from staring at trading screens. At 35, my youngest son looked like a man who'd given up on everything except his next big score. Dad. His tone was flat, unsurprised. I figured you'd show up eventually. Can I come in? He shrugged and stepped aside, leading me into a living room that looked like a tech support nightmare. Multiple monitors displayed cryptocurrency charts, price trackers, and mining statistics. Empty energy drink cans and takeout containers covered every available surface. Nice setup, I said, gesturing at the equipment. You here to lecture me about my life choices? Because Marcus and Diana already tried that. I'm here to talk about the house he stole while I was dying in a hospital bed. Kevin laughed, not humor, but the bitter sound of someone who'd stopped caring about consequences. Dying. You look pretty alive to me. Sorry to disappoint you, but we're stuck with each other a little longer. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This was the child I'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms. The boy who'd cried when his goldfish died. The teenager who'd promised to make me proud someday. What happened to you, Kevin? Life happened. Reality happened. The American dream turned out to be bullshit, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. He gestured at his mining operation with mock pride. You see all this? This represents $60,000 in equipment, purchased with borrowed money, to mine cryptocurrency, that's now worth about half what it was when I bought the machines. I'm losing money every day these things run, but I can't afford to shut them down because then I'd have nothing. So you decided to steal from me instead. Steal? His voice rose sharply. You want to talk about stealing? How about stealing my childhood to pay for Marcus's fancy education? How about stealing my college fund to cover Diana's wedding? How about spending my inheritance on a house that's too big for one old man who refuses to admit he needs help? The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Some of it was true. I had prioritized the older children's needs, had used money that might have gone to Kevin's education to keep the family afloat. But the rest was revisionist history, the kind of narrative that bitter people create to justify their failures. I gave you the same opportunities I gave your siblings. Really? Marcus got Harvard Law School. Diana got State University. I got community college and a lecture about working harder. You got community college because your grades weren't good enough for anything else. You got lectures because you kept making the same mistakes over and over. Right. It's all my fault. My addiction, my failures, my inability to live up to the golden children. He stood up abruptly, pacing like a caged animal. Do you know what it's like being the family screw-up? Do you have any idea what it does to a person to know that your own father has given up on you? I never gave up on you. Bullshit. You stopped lending me money. Stopped believing in my business ideas. Stopped taking my calls when I needed help. You wrote me off as a lost cause and put all your energy into Marcus and Diana. There was truth in his anger, painful truth that I'd been avoiding for years. I had stopped believing in Kevin's schemes because they always failed. I had stopped lending him money because he never paid it back. I had, in small ways, given up on him. But that didn't justify what he'd done. So your solution was to forge my signature and steal my house. My solution was to take what should have been mine anyway and use it to finally make something of myself. This cryptocurrency operation, it was going to work. I had projections, models, expert analysis, showing that we could have tripled the investment in 6 months. And then what? You'd have given me my share. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his screens. I don't know. Maybe. Probably. It didn't matter because you were supposed to die. The casual way he said it, you were supposed to die, crystallized everything I needed to know about my youngest son. He hadn't just stolen from me. He'd written me off as already dead. A problem to be managed rather than a father to be loved. The doctor said your heart surgery had complications. He continued, oblivious to the horror of his words. The mortality Rate for men your age was like 30%. We figured we had a 50-50 chance of this being a moot point. And if I lived, then we'd cross that bridge when we came to it. Maybe put you in a nice facility somewhere, visit on holidays, make sure you were comfortable, with stolen money, with invested money, with multiplied money, with money that was going to make all of us rich instead of just sitting in your bank account doing nothing. I looked around at his failed operation, the humming machines that burned electricity to create worthless digital tokens, the empty promises of easy wealth, the desperate fantasy of a man who'd never learned that success requires more than luck and wishful thinking. It's not working, is it? Your cryptocurrency scheme. His shoulders sagged. The market crashed 2 weeks after I bought the equipment. Everything I invested is worth maybe 20 cents on the dollar now, so you lost my money too. I lost everything. My money, your money, the money Marcus and Diana were counting on to solve their problems. It's all gone. For the first time since I'd arrived, Kevin looked genuinely defeated. The anger and defiance had drained away, leaving behind a broken man who'd bet everything on another sure thing that wasn't sure at all. What happens now? He asked. Now you face the consequences of your choices. You're going to press charges. That depends on whether you're willing to make this right. He laughed again, that same bitter sound. With what? I'm broke, Dad. Worse than broke. I owe money to people who aren't as patient as bank loan officers. Then you'd better hope your brothers and sister are more forgiving than you've been. I stood to leave, but Kevin's voice stopped me at the door. For what it's worth, I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted to stop failing for once in my life. I turned back to look at my youngest son, addicted, bitter, drowning in debts he'd never be able to pay. Kevin, you've been failing because you keep looking for shortcuts instead of doing the work. Stealing from your father isn't success. It's just another kind of failure. As I walked away from his townhouse, I could hear the cryptocurrency miners humming their electronic funeral dirge, burning money and hope in equal measure, while Kevin sat among the wreckage of his latest dream. Sarah Chen's office had transformed into a war room. Legal documents covered every available surface. Computer screens displayed court filings and case law, and a whiteboard mapped out the complex timeline of my children's fraud. The emergency injunction to stop the house sale had been granted, but that was just the opening salvo in what promised to be a long and brutal campaign. The good news is that your recordings are admissible, Sarah said, reviewing transcripts of my conversations with Marcus, Diana, and Kevin. Marcus's confession alone is enough to prove conspiracy and fraud. The bad news is that your children have hired serious legal representation. She handed me a business card. Thornton, Blackwell, and Associates Criminal Defense Specialists. The letterhead was expensive, embossed. The kind of firm that charged $500 an hour and earned every penny. How can they afford lawyers like this? They can't. But apparently Marcus convinced his partners that this is a family dispute that could damage the firm's reputation if it goes public. They're covering the legal fees as a business expense. The irony was, Perfect Marcus's law firm was paying to defend him against charges of defrauding his own father. The legal system was eating its own tail, and I was caught in the middle. What's their strategy? Sarah pulled out a thick folder. Diminished capacity. They're claiming that your post-surgical cognitive impairment makes you an unreliable witness to your own affairs. They've got medical experts prepared to testify that heart surgery and anesthesia can cause persistent memory problems in elderly patients. I'm not elderly, I'm 67. To a jury, that might be elderly enough. And they've got Dr. Amanda Foster ready to testify that she did examine you and found significant signs of dementia. She's a fraud. I've never met her. We know that, but proving it won't be easy. She's a licensed psychiatrist with 15 years of experience. Her credentials are legitimate, even if her evaluation wasn't. Sarah spread out more documents on her desk. They're also claiming that you gave verbal consent for the power of attorney while under medication, and that the forgery was just a bureaucratic shortcut to formalize an agreement you'd already made. The sophistication of their defense strategy was both impressive and terrifying. My children weren't just criminals, they were smart criminals with excellent legal representation. What about the recordings? Marcus confessed everything. They'll claim the recordings were made under duress, that you threatened or coerced their statements. Marcus is saying he only confessed because he was afraid of your volatile mental state. I felt a familiar anger building, the same cold rage that had carried me through firefights in Vietnam. So they steal my house, and I'm the one with mental problems. That's exactly what they're claiming. And unfortunately, it's a credible defense. Elder abuse cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute because the victims often do have cognitive issues that make their testimony questionable. The phone on Sarah's desk rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. Channel 7 News. That's the fourth call today. Media attention. Someone leaked the story. Local veterans' children accused of elder abuse was the headline in this morning's paper. She handed me a newspaper clipping that made my stomach clench. The story was factually accurate, but emotionally devastating. It described me as a confused elderly veteran whose troubled children had made difficult decisions about his care while he was incapacitated. The reporter had interviewed neighbors who described me as increasingly isolated and possibly suffering from dementia. Worst of all, they'd found a photo of me from the VFW newsletter, taken 6 months ago at a memorial service, looking gaunt and tired. Perfect for illustrating the narrative of a declining old man who needed protection from his own poor judgment. This makes me look pathetic. It's intended to. Your children's lawyers planted this story to shape public opinion before we get to trial. They're betting that sympathy will work in their favor. My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. Saw the news. If you need help, call me, Bill Patterson. Then another. Tucker, heard about your troubles. We're here for you. VFW Post 1247. Word was spreading through the veteran community, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone kept buzzing with messages of support, offers of help, and expressions of outrage that one of their own was being treated this way. There might be an upside to the media attention, Sarah observed, watching my phone light up with incoming messages. Veterans stick together. If this becomes a story about ungrateful children betraying a combat veteran, public opinion could shift in our favor. She was right. Within hours, the narrative was evolving. The VFW issued a statement condemning elder abuse of veterans. Local news stations were interviewing my former neighbors, who described me as sharp, independent, and fully capable of managing my own affairs. The American Legion announced they were forming a legal defense fund to help veterans fight financial exploitation, but the most powerful response came from an unexpected source: other families who'd experienced similar betrayals. Sarah's office was flooded with calls from elderly parents whose children had stolen from them, from siblings who'd watched brothers and sisters exploit their parents, from adult children who were horrified by what my kids had done. This happens more than people realize, Sarah explained. Financial abuse of elderly parents is one of the fastest growing crimes in America. Most families keep it quiet out of shame, but your case is forcing people to confront the reality. By evening, the story had taken on a life of its own. Social media was buzzing with #JusticeForTucker hashtags. Local lawyers were calling to offer pro bono assistance. Veterans organizations were organizing rallies and fundraisers. My children, meanwhile, had gone into hiding. Marcus's law firm issued a statement saying he was taking a leave of absence to address family matters. Diana had stopped answering her phone. Kevin's social media accounts had been deleted entirely. They're scared, Sarah said with satisfaction. This isn't the quiet family dispute they thought they could control. It's become a public reckoning with a crime that usually happens in the shadows. As I sat in Sarah's office, surrounded by evidence of my children's betrayal and my community's support, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my military days. The brotherhood of people who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. My children had stolen my house, but they'd given me something more valuable in return: the knowledge that I wasn't alone, that my fight mattered to people I'd never met, and that sometimes the worst betrayals can reveal the deepest truths about who we really are and who we can become when we refuse to surrender. The letter arrived on official Veterans of Foreign Wars letterhead, hand-delivered by Bill Patterson, who lived 3 houses down and had served in the Navy during the Gulf War. His wife Martha stood beside him on my front porch, holding a casserole dish and wearing the kind of determined expression that meant business. "Tucker," Bill said, extending the envelope. "This is from the state VFW commander. They voted to provide legal support for your case." I opened the letter with shaking hands. The Veterans of Foreign Wars had established a defense fund specifically for my situation, raising over $15,000 in less than a week, from posts across Virginia. More importantly, they were connecting me with a network of veterans who'd faced similar family betrayals. "You're not fighting this alone," Martha added, pressing the casserole into my hands. "Half the neighborhood has been wanting to help, but we didn't know how. Now we do." The casserole was still warm, and I realized it had been years since someone had cooked familiarly. Cooked not just dropped off leftovers or picked up takeout. The simple gesture of care hit me harder than all the legal documents and media attention combined. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Bill replied. Just let us help. That's what neighbors do. Over the next few days, my house became a gathering point for support that I hadn't expected and didn't feel I deserved. Mrs. Rodriguez from Diana's apartment building stopped by with information about other tenants who'd been exploited by family members. Former students of Diana's reached out to express their disappointment in their beloved teacher's actions. Even some of Marcus's colleagues quietly offered assistance, disgusted by his betrayal of professional ethics. The most surprising visitor was Emma, Diana's 7-year-old daughter, who appeared at my door with her mother one evening as the sun was setting. Diana looked exhausted and ashamed, but Emma carried her grandfather, drawing with obvious pride. "Mummy said we did something bad to you," Emma announced, with the directness that children with autism often possessed. "I made you a new picture to say sorry." The drawing showed the same stick figure family, but this time the house was much bigger, with room for everyone. "This is how it should be," Emma explained. "All of us together." Diana knelt beside her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "Emma wanted to see you. I know I don't have the right to ask, but you're always welcome here," I said, meaning it, despite everything. "Both of you." Emma hugged my legs with fierce intensity, and I felt something crack inside my chest, not anger or betrayal, but the recognition that this child was innocent of her mother's crimes and deserved better than to lose her grandfather over adult failures. After they left, I found myself thinking about the complexity of family loyalty. Diana had committed a serious crime, but she'd done it out of love for Emma. That didn't excuse her actions, but it made them more human, more forgivable than Marcus's calculated greed or Kevin's bitter entitlement. The veteran community's support continued to grow. A retired Marine colonel named James Mitchell contacted me through the VFW network. He'd fought a similar battle 5 years earlier, when his son had attempted to have him declared incompetent to gain control of his military pension. "The hardest part isn't the legal fight," he told me over coffee at the VFW post. "It's accepting that the people you raised and loved are capable of seeing you as an obstacle to their happiness instead of a human being deserving respect." Colonel Mitchell had won his case, but the victory had cost him his relationship with his son permanently. "Some bridges can't be rebuilt," he said, "but some can be reinforced and made stronger than they were before. The trick is knowing the difference." His words stayed with me as I prepared for the next phase of the legal battle. Sarah Chen had filed formal criminal charges against all 3 of my children, and the district attorney's office was taking the case seriously. But the real question wasn't whether we could win in court, it was whether winning would be worth the cost. That weekend, the VFW Post organized a barbecue fundraiser that drew hundreds of people. Veterans from 3 counties came to show support, bringing their families and their stories. I met a Korean War veteran whose daughter had stolen his Purple Heart to pawn for drug money, a Vietnam nurse whose son had emptied her savings account to fund his gambling addiction, a Gulf War veteran whose siblings had sold his house while he was deployed overseas. Family exploitation of veterans is more common than people want to admit, explained Dr. Sarah Washington, a VA social worker who'd been studying the problem for years. Military families often struggle with deployment stress, PTSD, and financial instability. When veterans age and become vulnerable, those same family dynamics can turn predatory. But I also met families who'd found healing after similar betrayals. Adult children who'd recognized their mistakes and worked to make amends. Parents who'd forgiven and rebuilt relationships on healthier foundations. Veterans who'd used their experiences to help others avoid the same pitfalls. The key, Dr. Washington told me, is distinguishing between people who made terrible mistakes and people who are fundamentally willing to harm others for personal gain. One can be redeemed, the other can't. As the sun set over the VFW barbecue, I watched families eating together, sharing stories, supporting each other through difficulties that would have seemed insurmountable alone. I thought about Emma's drawing all of us together in a house, big enough for everyone, and wondered whether that was still possible, or just a child's innocent fantasy. The answer, I was beginning to understand, would depend less on what my children had done to me and more on what they were willing to do for themselves. The legal system could punish their crimes and recover my property, but only they could decide whether they wanted to earn back the right to be called my family. The community that had rallied around me had given me something I hadn't expected, the strength to fight not just for justice, but for the possibility of redemption. Some battles were worth winning even when the victory came at a terrible price. The medical records arrived in a manila envelope, marked Helen M. Saldana, final disposition, sent by the hospital's records department, in response to Sarah Chen's subpoena. I'd avoided requesting these documents for nearly 20 years, unable to face the clinical details of Helen's final weeks. Now, as part of building our case about the house's true ownership, they'd become evidence in a battle she never could have imagined. I spread the papers across my kitchen table with trembling hands. Most of it was routine medication lists, treatment notes, consultation reports, but tucked between the oncology reports and nursing assessments, I found something that stopped my heart. A handwritten document, dated 3 days before Helen died. Personal property disposition, Helen Saldana, was written in my wife's careful script, though weakened by pain medication and advancing illness. Below that, in slightly shaky letters, I want the house to stay with Tucker always. This is his home, earned by his sacrifices for our family. The children have received their education and our love. That is their inheritance. The house belongs to Tucker until the day he dies. The document was witnessed by 2 nurses and notarized by the hospital's legal advocate. It wasn't a formal will. We'd never had enough assets to warrant one. It was a clear statement of Helen's intentions for our most valuable possession. I read it 3 times before the words truly sank in. Helen had known, even in her final delirium, that someday there might be a conflict over the house. She'd taken steps to protect me, to ensure that my children understood her wishes about the home where we'd raised them with such love and hope. Sarah Chen arrived within an hour of my phone call, studying the document with the intense focus of a detective who'd just found the smoking gun. "This changes everything," she said. "Your children can claim they thought they were acting in your best interests, but they can't claim they were honoring their mother's wishes. She explicitly wanted you to keep the house. They never knew about this. Doesn't matter. The law recognizes spousal property intentions, especially in cases involving long marriages and joint investments. This document proves that Helen understood the house as your security, your reward for the sacrifices you'd made for the family." I thought about Helen's final days, the conversations we'd had when she was lucid enough to talk. She'd worried constantly about leaving me alone, about how I'd manage without her strength and wisdom. I'd assured her that the children would take care of me, that the love we'd given them would come back when I needed it most. How wrong we'd both been. "There's something else," Sarah continued, pulling out another document. "I've been investigating your children's financial histories, and I found this." It was a copy of Helen's life insurance policy, $50,000 that had paid out immediately after her death. I'd used most of it to pay her medical bills and funeral expenses, but I clearly remembered giving each child $5,000 from what remained. "Look at the beneficiary designation." Sarah pointed to a line I'd never paid attention to. "Helen named you as primary beneficiary, but she added a note: funds to be used for Tucker's long-term security and housing stability." Another piece of evidence that Helen had been thinking about my future, planning for my protection, even as she faced her own mortality. The insurance money I'd shared with the children had been intended specifically for my care, not their immediate gratification. "Did you tell them about the note?" "I don't think so. I was so grief-stricken. I barely remember the financial details from that time." Sarah made notes on her legal pad. "So your children took money that was designated for your security, and 20 years later, they stole the house that your wife explicitly wanted you to keep. This establishes a pattern of disregarding Helen's wishes and your well-being." I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the garden Helen had planted, now overgrown but still showing traces of her careful design. She'd always been the practical one in our marriage, the one who thought ahead and planned for contingencies. While I'd been focused on daily survival, she'd been building safeguards for a future she wouldn't live to see. "She knew," I said quietly. "Knew what?" "That they might turn out this way. She saw something in them, even when they were young, that worried her." I remembered conversations Helen and I had late at night, when the children were asleep and we could speak honestly about our fears and hopes. She'd worried about Marcus's calculating nature, his tendency to see relationships as transactions. She'd fretted about Diana's people-pleasing, her willingness to sacrifice her own needs to avoid conflict. And Kevin, even as a child, Kevin had shown signs of the entitlement and resentment that would define his adult failures. "Your mother always said you were too trusting," Helen had told me once. "Too willing to see the best in people, even when they're showing you their worst." She'd been preparing me, in small ways, for the possibility that our children might not turn out to be the grateful, loving adults we'd hoped they'd become. The property documents were just one part of a larger pattern of protection she'd tried to build around me. That evening, I called Diana. She answered on the first ring, her voice small and frightened. "Dad, I found your mother's wishes about the house." A long silence. "What do you mean?" I read her the document word for word, listening to her breathing change as the implications became clear. "She knew," Diana whispered. "She knew we might do something like this. She knew you might need help, and she knew I might need protection. She tried to make sure both were available when the time came." "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." We dishonored her memory, along with everything else. For the first time since this nightmare began, Diana sounded like the daughter I'd raised, remorseful, honest, and genuinely horrified by what she'd done. The document hadn't just strengthened our legal case. It had stripped away the rationalizations and forced my children to confront the magnitude of their betrayal. Helen had been protecting me from beyond the grave, but she'd also been protecting them from becoming the kind of people who could betray their father without consequence. The document was more than legal evidence. It was a moral mirror that reflected the distance between who they'd been raised to be and who they'd chosen to become. "What happens now?" Diana asked. "Now you decide whether you want to honor your mother's memory or continue dishonoring it." After I hung up, I sat with Helen's photograph in my hands, the same wedding picture my children had left cracked on the floor. In it, she was radiant with hope and love, believing in a future where the family we'd built would be strong enough to weather any storm. She'd been wrong about that, but she'd been right about something more important. Love without wisdom is just sentiment, and protection without strength is just wishful thinking. The documents she'd left behind weren't just about property or money. They were about teaching me to value myself enough to fight for what was rightfully mine. For the first time since her death, I felt Helen's presence not as a memory of loss, but as a reminder of strength. She'd given me everything I needed to win this battle. Now it was up to me to be worthy of her foresight and her love. The drawing appeared on my kitchen table 3 days later, left there by Diana during one of her visits with Emma. It was different from the others. More detailed, more intentional. Emma had drawn herself holding hands with 2 adults, one labeled Mummy and another labeled Grandpa Tucker. Between them was a heart with the words, "I'm sorry," written in crayon letters that had clearly been erased and rewritten several times. At the bottom, in Diana's handwriting, was a note. "Emma made this after I explained that we hurt Grandpa. She wants to make it right. So do I." The phone rang while I was studying the drawing. Sarah Chen's voice was tight with excitement. "Diana just called. She wants to testify against Marcus and Kevin. What? That she's prepared to admit her role in the fraud and provide evidence about how the scheme was planned and executed. She's also willing to return her share of any money they recovered from selling your belongings." I sat down heavily in my chair. Diana's cooperation could be the difference between a difficult case and an overwhelming victory, but it would also mean she'd face serious criminal charges alongside her brothers. What about Emma? That's what she's most worried about. If she goes to prison, Emma would have to live with her father, Diana's ex-husband. Apparently, he's not equipped to handle a special needs child. The calculation was brutal. Diana could save herself by staying silent and letting Marcus and Kevin take the fall. Or she could do the right thing and risk losing her daughter. That she was choosing honesty despite the consequences told me something important about who she really was beneath the desperation that had driven her to crime. "There's more," Sarah continued. "Diana found something in Marcus's files, copies of communications with the fake doctor, bank records showing payments to co-conspirators, even a timeline of the fraud that Marcus kept, like a project plan. Marcus, the careful lawyer, had documented his own crimes. His legal training had taught him to keep detailed records, but he'd forgotten that documentation could be used against him as easily as for him. The next surprise came that evening when my doorbell rang. I expected Diana, or perhaps another veteran from the VFW, but instead found Marcus standing on my porch, looking like he'd aged a decade in the past month. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hollow. I let him in, studying his face as he sat in the same chair where he'd announced his college acceptance 25 years earlier. The confident young man who'd promised to take care of his old man someday had been replaced by someone who looked broken beyond repair. "Diana called me," he said. "She told me about Mom's documents, about her decision to testify, and she's right. We crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. We became people that Mom would be ashamed of, people that you deserved better from." Marcus pulled out a legal folder and set it on the coffee table between us. This contains everything, the real timeline of the fraud, the names of everyone we paid or coerced, copies of all the forged documents, bank records showing where the money went. I opened the folder to find a confession more detailed than anything Sarah could have extracted through legal proceedings. Marcus had laid out the entire conspiracy with the precision of a prosecutor building a case, except this time the case was against himself. Why? I asked. Because Diana reminded me of something I'd forgotten. You didn't raise us to be criminals. You raised us to be better than this. What we did, it wasn't just illegal. It was a betrayal of everything you taught us about honor and responsibility. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where he'd learned to ride a bike and played catch with his old man. I've been thinking about the day I passed the bar exam. You were so proud, remember? You told everyone that your son was going to be a lawyer, that all the sacrifices had been worth it. I remember. I became exactly the kind of lawyer I used to despise someone who uses the law as a weapon instead of a tool for justice. I did that to my own father. Marcus turned back to face me, tears streaming down his cheeks. I can't undo what we did, but I can make sure the whole truth comes out. Kevin's never going to take responsibility for his role in this. He's too far gone, too bitter and angry to see past his own resentment. But Diana and I, we can choose to be better. What about your practice, your family? My marriage is over. Linda's filing for divorce. She can't handle being married to someone who would defraud his own father. The law firms asked me to resign to avoid further damage to their reputation. I'll probably be disbarred. The consequences were devastating, but Marcus recited them without self-pity, like a soldier reporting casualty figures from a battle he'd chosen to fight. I'm sorry it's come to this, I said, and meant it. I'm not. For the first time in years, I'm doing something that's actually right instead of something that's merely legal. Maybe that's worth more than keeping a career I was failing at anyway. We sat in silence for several minutes, two men contemplating the wreckage of a relationship that had once been built on love and pride and hope for the future. There's something else, Marcus said finally. The money Kevin lost in his cryptocurrency scheme. I think I know how to recover some of it. He explained that Kevin's failed investment had involved a company that was now under federal investigation for securities fraud. Victims of the scheme might be able to recover portions of their losses through a restitution fund. It won't be everything, but it might be enough to pay for Emma's therapy and help Diana get back on her feet. Even in his own downfall, Marcus was thinking like a lawyer, looking for solutions that could help his sister and niece. It was the first completely selfless thing I'd seen him do in years. What do you need from me? I asked. Forgiveness. Eventually. Not today. Maybe not for years, but someday. I need to know that it's possible to earn back the right to be called your son. Looking at Marcus's broken, honest, finally willing to face the consequences of his choices, I felt something shift. Inside me, he'd committed terrible crimes, but he was also demonstrating the kind of character that could be rebuilt on a foundation of accountability and genuine remorse. It's possible, I said quietly. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take proving that this version of Yutha, one who chooses right over easy, is the real one. Marcus nodded, understanding that redemption would be a long journey with no guaranteed destination. But for the first time since this nightmare began, both of us could see a path forward that led somewhere other than permanent estrangement. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and supporters when I arrived for the hearing that would determine my children's fate. Veterans in their dress uniforms stood alongside neighbors and strangers who'd been following the case. Bill Patterson and his wife Martha flanked me as we walked through the crowd, while Sarah Chen briefed me on last-minute developments. Kevin's still refusing to cooperate, she said quietly. His lawyer's going to argue for a separate trial and claim he was manipulated by his older siblings, and Marcus and Diana. They're prepared to enter guilty pleas in exchange for reduced sentences and restitution requirements. The judge will have to approve the deal, but with their cooperation and the evidence they've provided, it should go through. Judge Catherine Morrison was a stern woman in her 60s who'd built her reputation on tough sentences for white-collar criminals. She reviewed the plea agreements with the methodical attention of someone who understood that this case would set precedents for how the legal system handled family financial abuse. Mr. Marcus Saldana, she began, you stand accused of conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and forgery. How do you plead? Marcus stood, his voice steady. Guilty, Your Honor. Ms. Diana Saldana, right? You stand accused of conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse. How do you plead guilty, Your Honor? Kevin's hearing was different. His lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, painted him as the victim of his siblings' manipulation. A troubled younger brother who'd been pressured into participating in a scheme he didn't fully understand. Your Honor, my client suffers from addiction issues and cognitive impairments that made him susceptible to manipulation by more sophisticated family members. Judge Morrison's expression suggested she wasn't buying it. Mr. Tucker Saldana, the evidence shows that you were instrumental in planning this fraud, that you recruited the corrupt medical professional, and that you lost the proceeds of your father's stolen property in high-risk investments. How do you plead? Kevin looked around the courtroom at me, at his siblings, at the packed gallery, and, for a moment, I thought he might finally accept responsibility for his choices. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and said, "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge's sentencing phase was swift and decisive. Marcus received 3 years in prison, with eligibility for early release based on cooperation and restitution. Diana received 2 years with the possibility of serving the time in a work release program that would allow her to continue caring for Emma. Kevin, maintaining his innocence, would face a separate trial with the possibility of much harsher penalties. If convicted, Mr. Tucker Saldana, Judge Morrison said, addressing me directly, this court finds that you were the victim of a calculated and sophisticated fraud perpetrated by people who owed you love and protection instead of betrayal and exploitation. The defendants will be required to make full restitution for all stolen property and assets, plus damages for emotional distress and legal costs. She paused, looking out at the packed courtroom. This case represents more than simple theft. It represents a violation of the most fundamental bonds of trust that hold families and society together. When adult children prey upon their aging parents, they undermine the very foundations of respect and care that define civilized behavior. The court judgment document was comprehensive. My house was restored to my name immediately. All sale proceedings were voided, and my children were jointly liable for over $200,000 in restitution and penalties. More importantly, the court had validated my competency and explicitly rejected their claims about my mental state. Outside the courthouse, the media scrum was overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions about forgiveness, about family reconciliation, about the broader implications of elder abuse cases. I found myself standing at a microphone, looking out at a crowd that included my children, my neighbors, and dozens of strangers who'd been touched by our story. This was never about revenge, I said, my voice carrying across the crowd. This was about accountability. You can't claim to love someone while simultaneously destroying them. Real love requires respect, honesty, and the courage to do right, even when it's difficult. I looked directly at Marcus and Diana, both standing with their lawyers, both crying openly. My children made terrible choices, but they also chose to face the consequences and try to make things right. That matters. Redemption is possible, but it has to be earned through actions, not just words. Kevin had already left, escorted by his lawyer through a side exit. He'd chosen defiance over accountability, and that choice would define his future in ways he was probably too angry to understand. The crowd began to disperse, but several veterans approached to thank me for fighting back, for refusing to let family exploitation go unchallenged. Colonel Mitchell, the Marine who'd fought a similar battle, gripped my shoulder firmly. You did good, Marine. You stood your ground and forced them to choose between right and wrong. That's all any of us can do. As I walked back to Sarah Chin's car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace, not happiness. The destruction of my family relationships was nothing to celebrate, but the quiet satisfaction of having fought the right fight in the right way. The house would be mine again. My belongings would be recovered or replaced. My financial security would be restored. But more than that, I'd learned something important about the difference between being victimized and being defeated. My children had victimized me, but they hadn't defeated me. I'd found the strength to fight back, the community to support me, and the wisdom to distinguish between justice and vengeance. Helen would have been proud of the man I'd rediscovered in the ashes of the family we'd built together. Some battles scar you. Others remind you who you really are. 6 months later, I sat at my kitchen table, signing the final documents that would establish the Helen Saldana Memorial Scholarship Fund for military families. The remaining savings bonds from my father's trunk, combined with the restitution, money recovered from my children's crimes, had created an endowment worth nearly $150,000, enough to help dozens of military families facing educational and medical expenses. Sarah Chen, who'd become more friend than attorney, watched me sign the papers with satisfaction. Your father would be proud. This fund will help families avoid the desperation that drove your children to make such terrible choices. The scholarship criteria were specific. Priority would be given to children with special needs, whose military parents were struggling with medical costs, and to veterans' children seeking education funding without burdening their families with debt. Every dollar would serve families who understood both sacrifice and honor. The first recipients have been selected, Sarah continued, handing me a folder with photos and applications. Emma Saldana is among them. I studied my granddaughter's application, submitted by Diana from the work release facility, where she was serving her sentence. Emma's therapy costs would be covered through high school, ensuring she'd have every opportunity to reach her potential, regardless of her mother's circumstances. How is Diana doing? Better than expected. She's been working with other inmates who've committed financial crimes against family members, helping them understand the impact of their actions. The program director says she's becoming one of their most effective counselors. Diana had found purpose in her punishment, using her experience to help others confront the rationalizations that made family exploitation possible. Her letters, which arrived weekly, showed a woman grappling seriously with the magnitude of what she'd done and working toward genuine transformation. Marcus's journey was different, but equally meaningful. His disbarment had been swift and total, but he'd used his legal skills to help other elder abuse victims navigate the system. Working with veterans organizations and legal aid societies, he'd become an advocate for the same people his crime had once victimized. He's applied for supervised visitation with Emma, Sarah mentioned. Diana's supporting the request. She thinks he's earned the chance to be part of his niece's life again. Kevin remained the holdout. His separate trial had resulted in a 7-year sentence, which he was serving with the bitter defiance that had defined his entire adult life. He'd refused all contact with the family and showed no interest in accountability or redemption. Some people can't be saved from themselves, I'd told Emma during one of our visits. She'd nodded with the solemn wisdom that special needs children often possessed, understanding that love couldn't fix everything, but that it was still worth offering. The house felt different now, not just because it was legally mine again, but because it had been reclaimed through strength rather than simply inherited through time. I'd stripped away the accumulated clutter of 40 years and filled the space with things that mattered. Emma's drawings on the refrigerator, letters from veterans who'd been helped by the scholarship fund, photos from VFW events where I'd spoken about family financial abuse. The garden Helen had planted was thriving again, tended by Martha Patterson and a rotating crew of neighbors who'd become more family than my actual children had ever been. The bird feeder stayed full, attracting cardinals and finches that reminded me daily of Helen's love for simple, beautiful things. On Sunday evenings, Emma visited for dinner and homework help. Diana would call from the facility, and we'd put her on speakerphone so she could hear about Emma's week, her progress in school, her latest artistic creations. These conversations were careful, formal, but genuine, the slow reconstruction of trust between people who'd learned that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. Marcus visited monthly, always bringing flowers for Helen's grave and updates on his advocacy work. Our conversations were stilted but honest, two men learning to rebuild a relationship on foundations of accountability rather than assumption. He'd earned back the right to sit at my table, but not yet the right to call me Dad without qualification. The new will I'd drafted with Sarah's help was detailed and ironclad. The house would go to Emma when she turned 25, with provisions for her special needs care managed by trustees who understood her condition. Marcus and Diana would receive modest bequests, only if they continued their community service and remained free of further criminal activity. Kevin would receive nothing unless he chose accountability over resentment, a choice that remained his to make. You've built something important here, Sarah observed, gathering the scholarship papers, not just the fund, but a model for how families can recover from betrayal without losing their capacity for love. That evening, I sat in my father's old chair, holding his Purple Heart, and reading a letter from a Marine wife in North Carolina, whose husband had lost his legs in Afghanistan. The scholarship fund would cover their daughter's autism therapy, allowing the family to focus on healing instead of choosing between medical care and financial survival. This was my father's real legacy, not the money he'd saved, but the example he'd set about using strength to protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. His savings bonds had become armor against desperation, weapons against the kind of family predation that destroyed trust across generations. The phone rang, displaying Diana's number from the facility. "Hi, Dad. Her voice was stronger now, more confident. Emma wanted to tell you about her new art project. Grandpa Tucker. Emma's voice bubbled through the speaker. I'm making a picture of our new house. It has room for everyone, but only if they're good. I smiled at the qualification. Emma had learned, through painful experience, that love required boundaries and that family membership had to be earned, not just inherited. That sounds perfect, sweetheart. Mummy says when she comes home, we're going to plant flowers in your garden. Different flowers for each person in our family, but only the ones who say sorry and mean it. From the mouths of babes came the wisdom that had taken me 67 years to learn. Forgiveness was possible, but it grew best in soil, prepared by genuine remorse and tended by consistent right action. As I hung up the phone, I looked around at the house Helen and I had built with love and sacrifice. It was smaller now, quieter, but stronger in the ways that mattered. The family that remained was reduced but refined, tested by betrayal and strengthened by the choice to value honor over convenience. Some battles destroy everything they touch. Others clear away what was false to make room for what is true. I'd fought for my home and won back more than I'd lost. I'd rediscovered who I was when I stopped being afraid to defend what I was worth. The Marine who'd gone to war in Vietnam was the same Marine who'd gone to war in a courthouse. And both battles had taught me the same lesson. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost seems too high to bear, especially then,